Blake and Harris laughed out loud as Dr. Naomi Carter walked into the courtroom, mocking her like she was nothing. But Naomi wasn't just another defendant. She carried the weight of 2 decades protecting national security. When the officers accused her of faking federal credentials, she faced not only humiliation, but the fight of her life. What happens when the woman they scorn finally speaks the truth? If this story grips you, don't forget to hit like and share it with others. Now let's step into the courtroom together. I was there that morning, standing under the yellow exit sign where the hallway bends toward courtroom B, coffee in one hand, file in the other. I remember the echo first, the kind that makes every shoe scuff sound like a gavel. Then she appeared. Dr. Naomi Carter, tall, straight-backed mid-40s, maybe in a navy suit that didn't ask permission to be taken seriously. She carried a leather briefcase stamped with a small federal crest, nothing flashy, just the kind of detail you notice when someone belongs to a room most of us only visit. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't hiding. She walked like a person who has rehearsed calm so long it has become muscle memory. That's when Officer Blake drifted off the wall and into her path. Officer Harris slid beside him, shoulder to shoulder, a 2-man door. They didn't say, "Excuse me." Blake tipped his chin, smirking at the crest on the briefcase, as if it were a joke only he understood. "Here comes the welfare queen," he said, loud enough to make the hallway turn its head. Naomi stopped. Not a dramatic stop, not a skid. Just a clean, precise halt, like a period placed exactly where it belongs. She didn't flinch. She didn't crack. She adjusted her grip on the briefcase and looked at him the way a surgeon looks at an X-ray patient, clinical, unhurried. Harris dropped into a mocking bow so deep his radio bounced against his chest. "Need help finding the food stamp office?" Blake chimed in, grinning at his own punchline. The laughter didn't roar. It scraped. A mean little sound that tried to make itself larger by how close it stood to its target. Across from me, a young guy in a gray hoodie raised his phone. He was quick, not reckless, held it just high enough to catch faces, not drama. Harris saw the lens before it caught a second of truth. He straightened, took one step toward the kid, and let his voice go cold. "Put that phone away or you'll spend the night in jail." No room for a misunderstanding. The phone lowered slow as a curtain. The kid backed against the wall, eyes fixed on the floor. You could feel the hallway recalibrate, curiosity folding into fear, fear pretending to be indifference. Blake turned back to Naomi, satisfied. If he'd expected a plea, he didn't get one. If he'd expected anger, he didn't earn that either. Naomi's face was unreadable in the way a locked door is unreadable. She took a single breath, measured, steady, and in that breath you could hear everything she was choosing not to say. Up the corridor, another uniform had stopped watching the foot traffic and started watching them. Officer Chen, younger than Blake, older than the rookie, smile still trying to live on his face. He wasn't laughing. He wasn't smirking. He stood with his hands resting on his duty belt, eyes moving from Blake to Harris to Naomi and back again, as if any second might ask him to decide who he was. "Ma'am," Blake said, drawing the word out until it sounded like an insult. "You lost." Naomi didn't bother with him. She looked beyond them at the door of courtroom B, then at the clock. She was right on time. She angled her briefcase to her side, squared her shoulders, and stepped forward. Harris shifted to block her. It wasn't a big move, just enough to make his presence felt on her shoulder line. The kind of move bullies practice until it feels like posture instead of pressure. Naomi stopped again. Another clean period. She lifted her eyes to meet his calm as a level. For a heartbeat, they held it there, his challenge, her refusal to play the part he'd written for her. Then she moved. Not around him, but through the space he'd left without realizing he had. Half-step, pivot, glide. It was choreography born from too many corridors like this one. "Hey," Blake said, annoyed that the scene he'd scripted wasn't hitting its marks. "Don't get fancy." All she did was keep walking. No shoulder bump, no last look. Just a quiet exit from a small performance she had never auditioned for. "Unbelievable," Harris muttered louder than necessary. "Must be nice to think the rules don't apply." Someone behind me whispered, "What's her deal?" It wasn't cruel. It was the kind of question people ask when the lines they've been taught don't explain the picture in front of them. Here's what I can tell you. It wasn't just 2 officers messing with a stranger. It was the way they felt permission to rehearse power on a woman who hadn't given them anything but silence. It was the way the hallway collaborated without meaning to how we all became scenery by staying still. And it was the way Naomi refused to trade her dignity for an argument she couldn't win, not because she was weak, but because she knew the fight was waiting where it mattered. Officer Chen's radio crackled. He didn't touch it. His eyes followed Naomi to the courtroom door, then flicked back to Blake. The look was quick, and it was honest, a ripple on water before the wind admits it has changed. At the threshold, Naomi paused. Not for them, for herself. She pressed her fingers to the latch, lifted her chin a fraction, and walked in. The door side shut behind her, soft as a secret. Blake exhaled through his teeth, impatient. "Let's go watch her try the important person act," he said, and Harris laughed like the joke hadn't gone stale 3 minutes ago. People moved again. Shoes scuffed, conversations resumed, the coffee cart hissed. But the air hadn't reset. It carried a bruise you could feel without touching. The kid in the gray hoodie slipped his phone into his pocket and shook his head. "Man," he whispered to no one in particular, "that ain't right." He was correct. It wasn't right. And if you want to know the truth, that hallway knew it. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to flicker with the effort of pretending not to see. I tossed my empty cup, fell into step with the current, and followed toward courtroom B. I wasn't thinking about schedules anymore. I was thinking about how some stories tell you what they are before a single witness is sworn in. Inside, a clerk arranged files. A bailiff cleared his throat. Somewhere, a judge adjusted her glasses. The stage was set, but not for the play those two had tried to stage out here. Because the briefcase Naomi carried wasn't a prop. It was a record. And records have a way of outliving performances. If you're waiting for a twist, it's not coming from the hallway. The twist is what happens when the laughter has to earn its place on the record. The twist is what happens when a woman who has spent her life keeping this country safe is told she belongs to the punchline and answers without raising her voice. We stepped inside, all of us officers, onlookers, the kid in the hoodie, me, like we were crossing a line we couldn't uncross. Harris nudged Blake and smirked like the outcome was already printed. Chen hovered near the aisle, quiet as a held breath. And Naomi. She took a seat at the defense table, set the briefcase down, and folded her hands. No drama, no speech. Just the kind of stillness that says, "I know what I brought, and I know why I'm here." That's where I'll leave you for now. At the exact moment a hallway's cheap theater gave way to a courtroom's harder light. If the opening act made you angry, it was supposed to. The question is whether that anger can sit still long enough to hear evidence. Because in the next room, the record is waiting, and so is the truth. I found a seat along the second row, close enough to read expressions, far enough to pretend I wasn't part of any of it. Dr. Naomi Carter set her briefcase on the defense table, palms flat for a second, like she was grounding herself. The room hummed with the small noises courtrooms make: paper, sliding a pen, clicking a throat cleared twice because once didn't work. That's when she appeared beside Naomi, a young woman with the same calm mouth but softer eyes. Leah Carter. 20, maybe. She leaned in, fingers closing around her mother's hand like she was afraid the room might try to take it. "Mom, why do you let them treat you like this?" she whispered. The question didn't rise. It sank in the way only a daughter's worry can. Naomi angled toward her shoulders, easing, a private weather passing over her face. "Sometimes silence is the loudest weapon," she said. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't a proverb dragged out for convenience. It sounded like something tested in fire and kept because it works. Leah nodded, but it was the nod people use when the answer makes sense without making it easier. You could feel the table recalibrate. Whatever they were about to face, they were going to face it holding hands. If you're wondering who Naomi is beyond the woman who just had to walk through a hallway she didn't deserve, here's what the record would eventually confirm. 2 decades serving national security. Not behind a podium, not just in a memo, but inside rooms where decisions come with real gravity. She helped design constitutional policing programs, dry words on paper, until you consider what they're for: teaching power, where its lines are, and what it owes the people it serves. I didn't know all that in the moment. What I knew was what I could see: a woman who wore authority the way some people wear posture. And a daughter who, despite the fear tightening her jaw, trusted that stillness more than she trusted the noise around them. Across the aisle, the prosecutor stacked yellow legal pads as if the height of the pile could promise a win. Blake watched, pleased with the room's arrangement, like a man who thinks the script is under his chair. Harris sat 2 seats back, texting, then not, then pretending he hadn't. Officer Chen stayed near the aisle. His face turned toward the door, as if the air might change if he watched it long enough. The judge's clerk called the calendar. The judge entered. We sat ritual doing what ritual does, trying to convince the human heart that order is possible. For a second, it almost worked. Maybe you've stood in rooms like this. You know how they compress time. One breath is a minute, 1 minute is a season. As the judge reviewed motions, I watched Naomi and Leah speak without sound. A glance, a squeeze, a mother's cheeks relaxing just enough to tell her child, "I'm okay. We're okay." What you need to understand is the contrast, not as a gimmick, as the scaffolding of the story. I have seen footage later when it was introduced of Naomi briefing senior officials. A windowless room, flags at her back, a map washed in soft blue light. She spoke without notes. She didn't hurry. She made eye contact the way people do when they owe you the truth and intend to pay. In that briefing, she outlined a framework for accountability: body cameras, verification protocols, independent review, nothing flashy, everything necessary. The president asked one question. Naomi answered in 3 sentences that fit together like a key. The room nodded, not because they were impressed, but because competence has a tone you can recognize even through speakers. Now place that image beside the one in front of me, the same woman, same spine, same calm, being forced to sit, while 2 officers who laughed at her in a hallway prepared to swear an oath. I don't know another word for it besides whiplash. Not the kind that hurts your neck, the kind that tries to divide a person into 2 truths and insists only one can exist. Leah saw it too. She adjusted the bracelet on her wrist the way people do when they're trying to keep their hands from shaking. I caught a glimpse of her notebook, no hearts, no doodles, just bullet points and underlines as if she were taking notes on how to be brave. "Ms. Carter, counsel," the judge said not unkindly. Grace Mitchell stood. Early 30s, focused, the kind of attorney who chooses verbs like tools, not weapons. She leaned down between mother and daughter. "We take this one step at a time," she murmured. Leah nodded again, this time with more light in it. "And then, because stories sometimes give you a sliver of the past to explain the present." My mind flashed back to Naomi in that briefing room. The camera caught a moment when she paused, not for effect, but to choose the cleaner word. "Public trust," she said, as if naming the point of the entire endeavor. "Without it, procedure is noise." Back in courtroom B, the prosecutor rose to frame the case. "This is a simple matter," he began, which is what people say when they intend to make a complicated thing obey a smaller box. As he spoke about routine stops and disorderly behavior, I watched Leah. Her gaze didn't leave her mother. When the words stung, she blinked slowly and reset her face. When the words stretched the truth, her jaw set. She looked like someone learning in real time what it costs to believe in the rules when the people holding them don't. Naomi's expression didn't change. It wasn't numb, it was intentional. That's what her sentence in the whisper meant. Silence isn't surrender, it's strategy. I could almost hear the rest of it, something like talk when it matters and make it matter when you talk. You might think a family moment can't belong inside a machine like this. It can. It has to. The law may run on records and exhibits, but people run on the sight of a mother's hands folded on a table and a daughter's hand on top of them, pressing like a seal that won't break. The prosecutor finished his overture. The judge nodded. We teetered on the edge of testimony. In the small pause, a fluorescent light flickered the way they do when a room has asked too much of a morning. I glanced at Officer Chen. He was staring at the briefcase again, the federal crest catching a thin stripe of light. Our eyes met for a second. He looked away. It was nothing, and it was not nothing. The kind of nothing that later becomes evidence of a decision, starting long before anyone speaks it out loud. Leah exhaled. Naomi turned her palm up so their fingers could interlock properly. It was a minor adjustment, the way you do with seatbelts before a ride you know might jolt. If the hallway introduced the insult, this is where you meet the reason it didn't land the way Blake intended. Not because it was harmless, no insult is harmless, but because this woman's life had trained her to let noise pass and bring the record. 20 years of learning where lines are and why they matter. 20 years of teaching others to respect those lines. And now, for reasons that say more about the men who stopped her than the woman they chose, she was going to have to prove she belonged inside the protections she helped write. "Counsel, proceed," the judge said. Leah squeezed once, then let go as if passing a baton you can't drop. Naomi lifted her chin a fraction, just enough to acknowledge the race had started, and faced forward. That's the shape of them if you need it. A mother who understands that quiet can be a shield. A daughter who understands that love can be a brace and a room that doesn't yet know it's about to hear a story. It will have to live with long after we all go home. The bailiff called his name, and Officer Daniel Blake walked to the witness stand like it belonged to him. His boots clicked steady, each step rehearsed. When he raised his right hand for the oath, he wore the same smirk I'd seen in the hallway. Confidence, not the quiet kind built on truth, but the noisy kind built on years of getting away with it. He leaned into the microphone and adjusted his uniform as though the fabric itself needed to be reminded of his authority. His first words rolled out strong, clear, the kind that can fill a room and choke it at the same time. On the evening of March 15th, he began. My partner and I conducted a routine traffic stop. Vehicle was traveling at least 15 miles over the posted limit. He paused there, letting the words hang like weights. A couple of jurors nodded automatically. Everyone has heard that story before, the ordinary excuse for the extraordinary abuse. Blake's eyes swept across them like he'd already counted the votes. The driver, Dr. Naomi Carter, pulled over immediately, but her attitude changed the second I approached the window. She handed over documents that looked official, but let me tell you, I've seen my fair share of fakes. She said she worked for Homeland Security, as if that would intimidate us into letting her walk away. He leaned back, lips curling just slightly. 15 years of dedicated service, he said, staring directly at Naomi, drawing out each syllable as if service itself were his shield. From where I sat, Harris shifted in his chair near the gallery, nodding so hard his cap nearly slipped. He smiled, approving every sentence like a choir boy shouting, "Amen." It wasn't just support, it was choreography. One man on the stand, one man echoing in the pews, making their story feel bigger than it was, and the jury. A few of them nodded along too. Not all, but enough. You could see it in their eyes, the reflexive trust given to a badge, the instinct to believe the uniform before the woman sitting at the defense table. That's the kind of power you can't measure until you watch it tip the scale in real time. Naomi didn't flinch. She sat with her hands folded, her expression unreadable, the kind of calm that unsettles because it leaves no handhold. She wasn't cowed and she wasn't rattled. She let him speak, let him build his stage. Silence can do that. It makes the noise sound louder than it deserves. Blake continued, his voice smooth now, almost conversational. She started waving around these papers, acting like she was someone special. I told her straight, we don't play games with fake credentials. That's when she got hostile, evasive. My partner and I had no choice but to proceed with an arrest. Choice. He used the word like it absolved him. Harris again nodded hard enough to echo. I glanced to the far side of the room. Officer Chen sat quietly, shoulders stiff, chin angled down. He didn't join in the ritual nodding. He didn't smile. His hands clenched on his knees, knuckles whitening as if they were betraying the tension he wouldn't show in his face. Watching him, you could sense the truth pressing in on him already, though he hadn't spoken a word. Back on the stand, Blake leaned forward, lowering his voice just slightly for effect. In my professional opinion, Your Honor, it was intimidation. She thought if she claimed to be federal, we'd back down. I wasn't going to let that happen on my watch. Not after 15 years of doing this job right. There it was again, 15 years. As if time alone were virtue. As if repetition made misconduct honorable. The prosecutor smiled, faintly satisfied. The jurors scribbled notes, one man even leaning back like the matter was already settled. I felt the knot in my stomach tighten. It wasn't just his words, it was the way the room was responding, like they'd forgotten how lies can wear a uniform too. Naomi sat still, only the faintest lift at the corner of her mouth betraying her thoughts. Not amusement, something closer to pity. She knew what he was building. She knew what it meant. And she knew that every brick he laid was one he might regret when the foundation shifted. The gavel hadn't struck, the questions hadn't even begun, but the stage had been set. Officer Blake's performance carried weight. The courtroom leaned toward him, the system tilting in his favor. But not everyone in that room was convinced. And if you watch closely at the jury's uneven nods, at Harris's overeager smile, at Chen's uneasy silence, you could see it. The cracks were already forming. And Naomi, she kept her silence, her eyes steady, letting him talk. Because sometimes the best way to catch a man digging is to hand him the shovel and wait. Attorney Grace Mitchell rose from her chair, smoothing the front of her blazer with the kind of ease that comes from knowing exactly when to move. She was young, early 30s, but there was nothing unsteady about her. Her voice carried a crisp edge as she addressed the judge. Your Honor, the defense asked permission for Dr. Carter to give her own account of the events. The judge nodded. A small gesture, but it shifted the air. All eyes turned toward the woman who had been silent since she stepped into the courtroom. Naomi Carter stood slowly, deliberate, as though even the act of rising had weight. She placed her hands on the wooden railing of the witness stand, not clinging, but anchoring herself. For a moment, she simply looked at the room, the judge, the prosecutor, the officers, the jury. Her gaze landed on each one like a mark left in stone. When I was pulled over on March the 15th, she began, her voice steady. I complied immediately. I pulled my vehicle to the side of the road as I have taught others to do. I rolled down my window. I kept both hands visible. Every motion I made was slow, deliberate, so that nothing could be mistaken as a threat. She paused, allowing the words to sink in. This wasn't a story told in anger, it was testimony delivered with precision. I informed the officer that I would need to reach into my briefcase to retrieve my identification. I did so slowly. Along with my license and registration, I also presented my federal credentials as required by protocol when federal employees are detained while traveling on official duty. Naomi drew a breath, and in that breath, the jury leaned closer. Officer Blake looked at the documents for only a few seconds before tossing them back at me. He laughed. And then he said, she turned slightly, her eyes flicking toward Blake before resting on the jury again. Save the act for someone who's impressed. The words hit the courtroom like a drop of ink in water, spreading, staining, undeniable. Officer Harris then spoke into his radio. I heard his exact words. We've got a live one here. She thinks she's FBI or something. The echo of those words tightened the room. Harris shifted in his seat, clearing his throat, but Naomi did not look at him. Her focus remained on the jury, her voice calm, almost too calm for the ugliness she was describing. My training taught me never to argue with men who mistake power for authority, she said. So I did not argue. I remained silent. I followed their commands even when they contradicted each other. I let them lead me from my car. I let them search my belongings. I let them place me under arrest. Her tone didn't rise. It didn't need to. It cut through the silence with the weight of someone who has lived in rooms where words decide fates. You may wonder why I stayed silent, she continued, because silence is not weakness. It is not surrender. It is discipline. I knew that shouting the truth in that moment would not protect me, but I also knew that truth has a way of surfacing, if not in the heat of headlights, then in the clear light of this courtroom. The jury barely moved. One woman pressed a hand against her throat. A man scribbled something quickly on his pad. Even the judge leaned forward slightly, her pen frozen above her notes. Naomi's eyes swept across the room once more. They did not plead. They did not beg. They demanded attention by refusing to demand it. This case, she said quietly, is not about an angry driver with a bad attitude. It is about officers who mocked lawful credentials, ignored procedure, and turned compliance into cause for arrest. It is about what happens when authority forgets its obligation to the law. She let the silence after that sentence stretch long enough for everyone to feel the weight of it. No movement, no shuffling papers, no nervous coughs. Just the stillness of a room realizing it had underestimated the woman before it. Then Naomi sat back down, folding her hands in front of her once more, her face composed. She had not shouted. She had not raised her fist. She had not tried to overpower the story Blake had spun. She simply told her own, and in its quiet force, it sounded stronger than anything that had come before. For the first time since the trial began, the room belonged to her. That evening, when the courthouse emptied and the crowd's murmurs had faded into memory, Naomi Carter carried the weight of the day back to her own front door. The lock clicked behind her, and silence greeted her like an old friend. No flashing cameras, no pounding gavel, just the hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. She set her briefcase on the dining table leather, worn but dignified, and loosened her blazer. The day had taken more out of her than she wanted to admit. With deliberate care, she opened the case and spread its contents. Transcripts, affidavits, notes from her attorney, pieces of truth, scattered like puzzle fragments. A framed photograph leaned against the lamp. It showed Naomi years ago at the FBI Academy uniform pressed chin, lifted a glimmer of hope in her eyes. She touched the glass gently, almost as if the younger woman inside could still steady her. The house wasn't empty for long. Leah appeared at the doorway, her hair loose from the day, her face tense with worry she could no longer hold back. "Mom," she said, her voice breaking, "what if the jury believes them?" Naomi turned slowly, her features softening, as though she had been waiting for this moment. She opened her arms and Leah rushed into them, burying her face in her mother's shoulder. Naomi held her firm but gentle, the way she had held her as a child after nightmares. "Baby," Naomi whispered, stroking her daughter's hair, "I've seen tyrants fall because they talk too much. These men are no different." Leah clung tighter, her sobs muffled against Naomi's blouse. For a moment, time folded in on itself. Naomi wasn't the woman mocked in a courthouse today, but the mother who had always been the safe harbor. When Leah finally pulled away, her eyes red but calmer, Naomi kissed her forehead and guided her toward her room. "Sleep, sweetheart," she said softly. "Tomorrow will come, and we'll face it together." When the bedroom door clicked shut, Naomi returned to the table. She gathered the papers, stacking them in neat piles, but her hands trembled, scattering them again. She tried once more, slower this time, yet the pages seemed to slide from her grasp, defying order. Her jaw tightened, her chest rose and fell unevenly. She pressed her palms flat on the table, forcing her body to stillness, but the pressure broke from inside. Her discipline, so rigid in the courtroom, so practiced over years of service, cracked. Naomi lowered her head onto the paper, shoulders shaking. Tears slipped silently onto documents meant to protect her, blurring the ink. For the first time in days, she let herself cry. Alone, unseen, she let the truth of her exhaustion pour out. It wasn't weakness, it was release. And it was the only way she could find the strength to stand again tomorrow. Across town, in a bar that smelled of smoke and stale beer, Officer Harris was living a different night. He leaned on a sticky counterpint, glass in hand, voice raised above the jukebox. "She won't win," he boasted, his laugh sharp and ugly. "The jury's with us. Always has been. Always will be." His friends hollered approval, clapping him on the back, feeding his bravado. Harris drank it in like proof that the system was his armor. "You should have seen her face," he bragged, acting like she was somebody important. "Papers and titles don't mean a damn thing in my courtroom." The bartender wiped the counter, shaking his head but saying nothing. The silence was its own kind of complicity, the same silence that had filled the courthouse hallway earlier. Harris mistook it for agreement, raising his glass high. "To justice," he shouted, grinning wide. It wasn't justice. It was arrogance, dressed as certainty. The foam of his beer sloshed over the rim, spilling onto the counter, a small, careless mess no one bothered to clean. He laughed louder, blind to the storm already gathering against him. Back at the Carter house, Naomi's sobs softened into quiet breaths. She wiped her face, straightened the papers once more, and looked again at the photo from the academy. Her younger self stared back at her, eyes burning with promise. Naomi whispered to the silence, "I will not let them rewrite who I am." 2 different rooms, 2 different nights, one soaked in tears, the other drowned in laughter. But both were moving toward the same collision, one that would expose arrogance for what it was and reveal the quiet power of truth. Grace didn't telegraph it. No throat clearing, no dramatic pause. She simply stood, asked the court to admit a short video from the defendant's dashboard camera, and waited while the bailiff dimmed the lights. The screen dropped from the ceiling with a soft whir. I felt the room lean forward as if pulled by a single string. The first frame was a windshield, night air, a wash of headlights, the soft pulse of the car's interior glow. Then audio. 2 male voices before any officer ever stepped into view. $20, she plays the race card before I even ask for her license, one said, Blake's voice bright with swagger. "You're on," the other replied, Harris, amused, like cruelty was a game you could win. A murmur rippled through the gallery. It wasn't loud. It was low and stunned, the sound people make when the mask falls off in public. On the front row, a juror's pen froze mid-note. Another juror's mouth opened and didn't close. The video moved on. Naomi's car eased to the shoulder. The driver's window slid down. Her hands were at 10 and 2 visible, steady. You could hear her voice, calm, professional. "Officer, I'm reaching into my briefcase to retrieve my license and registration. I will move slowly." She said it like training. Because it was. Blake came into view, posture wide, chin up. Harris hovered behind, already smirking at a joke only they could hear. Naomi lifted her documents with 2 fingers, extended them without touching the door. "Step out or I'll make you," Blake snapped. He didn't ask for the license. He didn't look at the paperwork. He didn't say why. He just reached for the speed of his own temper and pressed down. From the defense table, Naomi didn't move. She watched the screen the way a surgeon watches a monitor, knowing the image will decide what happens next. Leah beside her had both hands wrapped around her mother's knuckles, white. Grace let the recording run another few seconds. The camera captured small things that courtrooms usually miss: a flash of disbelief on Naomi's face before she smoothed it away. The brief, contemptuous glance Blake threw at the federal crest on her briefcase. The cheap thrill in Harris's chuckle, the kind of laugh that grows when it thinks no one is listening. Then the whisper, barely there, but the mic caught it. "If this lady reports us, our careers are done," Blake muttered, eyes still on Naomi. Harris answered with a snort. "She won't." The room inhaled all at once. It felt like the walls came closer, as if the building itself wanted to hear better. I saw the prosecutor shift in his chair, suddenly fascinated by the edge of his legal pad. Blake's jaw set hard. Harris stared at the screen like it was speaking a language he'd never learned. On the video, Naomi remained composed. "Sir, if you allow me to contact my supervisor, we can verify my credentials immediately," she said, steady as a metronome. Blake didn't take the offer. He didn't even dignify it. "Step out," he repeated, each word pushed through his teeth. The Dashcam caught everything: the restraint, the insult, the threat, and the truth neither man thought would ever echo in a room like this. It ended on the squeak of Naomi's door opening and the thin metallic ping of a seatbelt retracting, ordinary sounds that in that moment felt like alarms. Grace nodded to the bailiff. "Lights up." The screen slid back into the ceiling, but the quiet didn't return with it. It stayed tense, bright-edged, like a storm that refuses to move on. Leah made a small sound, half gasp, half sob, and pressed her face toward her mother's shoulder. Naomi turned her hand palm up so their fingers interlocked properly. She didn't shush her daughter. She didn't tell her to be brave. She let Leah feel what the room was feeling, that the story we'd been sold a few minutes ago had just been repossessed by the facts. From the jury box came the faint scrape of a chair leg, the kind of fidget that means a mind has changed or is about to. One juror blinked hard, as if trying to clear grit from her eyes. Another stared at Blake like he'd never seen him before. Grace didn't add commentary. She didn't need to. She looked at the judge, then at the jurors, then finally at the screen's empty space, as if to remind everyone that absence can be evidence too. I glanced toward Officer Chen. His eyes were glassy, fixed on the spot where the video had been. He swallowed and rolled his shoulders back, a quiet reset, like a man choosing which voice he intends to live with when this is done. What the video proved was simple and devastating, Naomi complied. The officers mocked, and when confronted with lawful credentials, they chose aggression over procedure, and did it knowing exactly what it could cost them. The judge cleared her throat. Paper shifted. Somewhere a pen clicked twice, but the spell didn't break. The room had heard the men in their own words. And once you hear that, you can't pretend you didn't. Grace Mitchell stood, her heels clicking softly against the polished wood as she approached the witness stand. The courtroom was still buzzing from the Dashcam video, but her voice cut clean through the tension. "Your Honor, the defense calls Officer David Chen." Every head turned. Chen rose slowly from his seat near the back. His uniform seemed heavier on him than it had that morning. He walked the aisle like a man heading into a storm, each step deliberate but reluctant, as though his own conscience were pushing him forward. When he took the oath, his hand trembled. He sat down, shoulders tight, eyes darting anywhere but toward Blake. Grace didn't waste time. She leaned just slightly on the podium, her tone steady, unhurried. "Officer Chen, you were present during the events of March 15th, correct?" "Yes," he said, voice low. "You witnessed the stop, the interaction, the arrest?" "Yes." She let the words sit there a moment, then asked, "Did Officer Blake make racially disparaging remarks toward Dr. Carter?" The room held its breath. Chen froze, his lips parted, but no sound coming out. His eyes flicked once toward Blake, who sat rigid, jaw locked, staring like a man daring him to speak. The silence stretched heavy and unbearable until Grace stepped closer. Officer Chen, she said gently, this is your chance to tell the truth. Diddy Chen's throat bobbed. He dropped his gaze to the table, then finally lifted it toward the jury. His eyes were red, and when he spoke, it was barely above a whisper. Yes. The word cracked the air. Gasps scattered through the gallery. Blake's face went stone white. Harris shifted in his seat, his smirk faltering for the first time. Grace nodded once. Thank you. Now when Dr. Carter presented her credentials, what did you recommend? Chen exhaled hard like the admission itself had knocked the wind from him. I told Officer Blake we should call federal verification. It's standard protocol. And what was his response? Chen closed his eyes a moment before forcing the words out. He said, I'm not getting punked by some wannabe with fake papers. He refused to call it in. The statement landed like a hammer. The jurors leaned forward. The judge's brow furrowed. Even the clerk, usually expressionless, paused in her notes. Blake shifted, trying to mask his anger with a sneer. But Chen wasn't finished. His hands clenched together, knuckles whitening, as if he could wring the guilt out of them. I should have spoken up earlier, he said, his voice breaking. I knew what was happening wasn't right. I saw it, I heard it, and I stayed quiet. His words wavered, but they carried a weight the Dashcam hadn't captured, the human cost of silence. The gallery was utterly still, hanging on each syllable. Grace's tone softened, but it carried an edge that drew blood. Why did you stay quiet, Officer Chen? His eyes glistened. Because it's easier. Because speaking up against your own, it makes you a target. But watching that video, hearing those words again, I can't sit here and pretend anymore. The jury saw it too, the tremor in his voice, the crack in the wall. A system that thrived on silence had just lost one of its bricks. Naomi sat with her head slightly bowed but her eyes on Chen. Not anger, not triumph. Something deeper, recognition of the price he was paying and the truth he was finally releasing. Beside her, Leah squeezed her mother's hand, whispering through her tears. He's telling them, Mom. The room swelled with a different kind of tension now, not the arrogance of unchecked power, but the raw sound of a man confessing what the uniform had trained him to hide. Grace stepped back, her expression calm but victorious. She didn't need to hammer the point. Chen had done it himself. The mini-climax had arrived. For the first time, the thin blue wall cracked in full view of the jury, and in that silence, as Chen lowered his head, it was clear the truth had slipped past fear, and the story Blake tried to control no longer belonged to him. Grace didn't change her posture. She didn't flash a smile or savor the moment. She simply waited for the rustle in the courtroom to settle, then lifted a single page from her binder, holding it like a passport through a crowded border. Your Honor, she said, voice, even as noted in our pretrial filings, defense counsel, served notice to the Department of Homeland Security 2 weeks ago. We requested confirmation of the defendant's status and the official protocols that apply when federal personnel are detained while on duty. That correspondence included a certified request for records and, if necessary, an in-person custodian to authenticate them. The judge glanced over her glasses. Yes, Miss Mitchell, I have the notice. Grace nodded once and then placed the page on the lectern. The department has responded. She didn't elaborate. She didn't have to. The gallery picked up the implication a half second before the doors at the back of the courtroom opened with a soft hydraulic sigh. 2 agents entered, first black suits, earpieces, eyes scanning without drama. Behind them came a man in his late 50s, tall, the kind of posture that makes you think of briefing rooms and midnight calls. His tie was muted, his expression neutral, and the identification wallet in his left hand was already open to the seal. The bailiff stood instinctively. Identify yourself, he said, but the tone had already softened. Deputy Secretary Jonathan Reed, Department of Homeland Security, the man answered, voice low and practiced. He stepped forward, agents fanning out to the perimeter in a choreography that drew no attention to itself and every bit of attention to him. Blake went very still. Harris blinked twice as if the light in the room had changed. In the jury box, heads tilted in unison, the way people do when they're trying to reconcile the story they've been told with the evidence in front of them. Reed didn't look at anyone specific at first. He looked at the room the way a pilot looks at his instruments before takeoff. Then he approached the clerk's desk and set down a slim, hard-sided folder. The federal seal caught a shard of light and held it. Your Honor, Grace said, as if announcing a routine witness, The department's custodian of records is present with authenticated documentation responsive to our request. The judge's eyebrows lifted a fraction. Mr. Reed, I'll need to know what exactly you intend to put on this record. Reed's answer was careful, not theatrical. Certified copies of Dr. Carter's federal credentials, her travel orders for March 15th, indicating official duty, and a letter under my signature describing her current role. I am prepared to testify to authenticity and, if the court wishes, to the relevant protocols that should have governed the encounter described. The prosecutor shifted like his chair had just become too small. Your Honor, the state may object after it hears the foundation, the judge said, not unkindly. She nodded to the bailiff. Please swear the witness. Reed raised his right hand palm steady and took the oath. He sat without ceremony. When he opened the folder, the sound of the class seemed to startle the room into silence. Grace approached questions, measured as if she were laying tiles. Please state your name and position for the record. Jonathan Reed, Deputy Secretary, Department of Homeland Security. And in that role, are you familiar with Dr. Naomi Carter? Yes. In what capacity? Reed looked to the jurors when he answered, not to the lawyers. Dr. Carter is Homeland Security's top advisor on constitutional compliance in federal and joint law enforcement operations. He paused, then added, she authored, drafted, and led the interagency adoption of the very statutes and protocols that local officers are expected to follow when encountering federal personnel. The words did not boom. They didn't need to. They landed with the precision of a stamp on wet ink. The juror in the front row pen stopped midair, let it drop into the trough of the notebook. Another juror's mouth parted, finally forming a soundless "oh." Grace kept her face neutral. Mr. Reed, I'm showing you what's been marked Defense Exhibits D through H. Do you recognize these documents? I do. What are they, Doctor? Carter's federal identification and credential records, her active travel orders covering March 15th, an internal memo confirming her briefing schedule that day, and a letter from my office certifying her role and responsibilities. Are they authentic and kept in the regular course of DHS business? They are. Your Honor, Grace said, we move to admit. The prosecutor rose, voice tight. Objection. Prejudicial value substantially outweighs probative. The judge shook her head gently. Overruled as to foundation. The jury is entitled to the truth of who the defendant is. Exhibits D through H are admitted. The clerk took the papers. The seal flashed again as it passed hands. In the gallery, someone exhaled like they'd been holding their breath since morning. Grace didn't rush. Mr. Reed, briefly, when a federal employee is detained on official travel, what is the standard protocol for verifying credentials? Reed folded his hands. The officer is expected to review the credentials, contact the federal duty officer if there is doubt, and document the interaction. There is no prohibition on issuing citations if warranted, but intimidation is expressly forbidden. Escalation without cause, especially in the face of offered verification, violates training and common sense. And if an officer declines verification and proceeds to arrest, we would expect a complaint. We would expect accountability. Grace nodded. Thank you. No further questions. She stepped back. That's when Reed turned, not dramatically, but with the deliberateness of a person who chooses where to put his words. He looked at Blake, first, then Harris, then just for a beat at the bad-shaped emptiness their posture couldn't hide. This woman, he said, not raising his voice, has protected this country for decades. And this is how she was treated. The sentence cut through the room like a clean rip. No one moved. Harris's fingers, which had been drumming a rhythm on his knee, went still. Blake's jaw twitched once and stayed clenched. Reed returned his attention to the judge. I'm not here to argue the law. The court has the law. I'm here to put facts in their proper places. Maybe that's why it worked. There was no grandstanding. The authority arrived, did its job, and refused to decorate itself. The foreshadowing Grace had laid earlier, her notice to DHS, her calm references to protocol, suddenly clicked into a picture with edges you could trust. From the defense table, Naomi didn't smile. She didn't change at all. She simply placed her fingers over the corner of the admitted exhibits, a small touch that read, like gratitude and resolve in equal parts. Leah beside her wiped a tear and managed a quick nod to Grace. The prosecutor tried to recover ground. Deputy Secretary Reed, You understand that titles don't place anyone above the law. Reed's mouth lifted, not quite a smile. I do. That's why Dr. Carter helped write it. A low murmur rolled and then broke. The judge tapped her gavel twice more to restore breathing, then order. Counsel keep questions to relevance. The cross-examination limped on technicalities about travel orders, dates, chains of custody. Reed answered each with a simplicity that made the questions look like they were trying to hide inside their own words. By the time the prosecutor sat down, the shine had left his legal pad entirely. I glanced at Officer Chen. He was upright now, shoulders square, the earlier tremor, replaced by something quieter but firmer. It's a particular relief. You only recognize it after you see the truth spoken out loud and realize it matches what your bones already knew. The jury, for their part, had shifted from watching a performance to reading a ledger. Eyes moved from Reed to the exhibits to Naomi and back again. The room had recalibrated. Authority no longer belonged to the loudest microphone. It had moved to the clean weight of the record. Grace rose for one final question, the kind you only ask when you know the answer is a beam, not a mirror. Mr. Reed, to your knowledge, did Dr. Carter act within the scope of her duty on March 15th? Yes, he said, and within the scope of her character. It was a small grace note, almost too human for a transcript. But the court reporter caught it, and the jurors heard it, and something in the posture of the room changed for good. The judge dismissed the witness. Reed closed the folder, stood and inclined his head to the court, the way you do when you respect a place enough to leave it intact. He didn't look at Blake and Harris again. He didn't need to. The documents on the clerk's desk were doing that work without help. As the agents guided him toward the doors, the gallery remained hushed. Not out of fear, out of recognition. We'd all just watched the truth walk in wearing a badge that didn't need to prove itself. When the door sides shut, the courtroom breathed. The gavel rested. Grace returned to counsel table. Naomi folded her hands. Leah slid her fingers into the space her mother left for them. And in that quiet, you could feel the whole case tilt away from swagger and toward the simple, stubborn weight of what's real. No fireworks, no speeches. Just a record finally standing where it belongs. Grace rose from her chair with a folder so thick it seemed to bend under its own weight. She carried it to the witness stand like a weapon, but her voice when she spoke was calm and steady. Officer Blake's personnel file, she said, laying it flat where the jurors could see. Dozens of complaints, wrongful stops, excessive force, and look closely, over 80% of the complainants were people of color. She opened the file pages, whispering against each other, and spread them out. Dismissed, 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 not sustained. She let each word fall like a gavel. But complaints don't vanish just because paperwork buries them. Patterns leave shadows. Blake shifted in his seat, jaw clenched, but Grace wasn't looking at him. Her eyes cut to Harris, who had been sitting rigid, shoulders tight. Officer Harris, she said sharply, you rode with him. You heard his words. You saw his conduct. Why didn't you report him? For a moment, Harris didn't move. Then his shoulders sagged. His chin dipped. His voice was barely audible. He said it was just cop talk. The gallery stirred, whispers rising like a low wind. Grace stepped closer, her voice pressing the weight of his words into the room. Just cop talk, she repeated. Ladies and gentlemen, you heard it yourself. That phrase isn't an excuse, it's an admission. It means mockery instead of respect. It means silence instead of accountability. She turned toward the jurors fully, now her eyes holding theirs one by one. This isn't about one traffic stop, she said, her tone lifting sharp but controlled. This is about a system that allowed laughter to stand where justice should have stood. About officers who believed they could twist power into a punchline, and about a culture that protected them until today. The words hung in the air. Even the judge, usually stone-faced, looked down at her bench for a long moment before lifting her gaze again. Grace closed the folder, slowly pressing her hand to the top as if sealing it shut. Dr. Naomi Carter followed every rule offered, every credential, obeyed every command. And for that, she was mocked, dismissed, and arrested. If that can happen to her, someone who wrote the very laws these men swore to uphold, what does that mean for the rest of us? Silence wrapped the room. No one moved. The jurors sat, stiff eyes locked forward, pens still. Blake stared straight ahead, pale now, while Harris's hands twisted together on his lap. All the noise of the trial, the laughter, the denials, the objections was gone. What remained was the truth, sharp and undeniable, waiting for the jury to give it voice. The air felt thick, almost too heavy to breathe. Every eye in the courtroom turned toward the jury box, as if the walls themselves were leaning in. And that was the moment, the final spark before judgment, when the entire room realized the case was no longer about what Naomi said or what Blake denied. It was about what the jury would choose to believe, a system built on silence, or a woman who had carried the truth in her briefcase all along. The jury filed back into the box, faces pale and unreadable. The foreman stood clutching the folded verdict form like it weighed 100 pounds. The judge asked the question, the one the whole room had been waiting for, and the foreman's voice cracked as he read. On the charge of deprivation of civil rights under color of law against Officer Daniel Blake, we find the defendant guilty. The air snapped as if every breath in the room released at once. Blake's head dropped into his hands. On the charge of conspiracy to violate civil rights against Officer Robert Harris, we find the defendant guilty. Harris closed his eyes. The gavel struck once, and the trial that had begun with mocking laughter ended in stunned silence. The judge delivered sentencing swiftly. Blake, 2 years in federal prison, stripped of his badge, forbidden from ever wearing one again. Harris, his conviction lighter but his career gone, his shield revoked, his authority dissolved. 6 months later, Blake wore polyester instead of pressed blue. A mall security uniform, stiff and cheap, clung awkwardly to his frame. His plastic badge gleamed dully under fluorescent lights as he walked past teenagers who didn't even notice. Once he had barked orders in a courtroom. Now he asked shoppers not to loiter by the food court. The man who thought he owned respect now discovered what it felt like to be invisible. Outside the courthouse on the day of the verdict, Naomi stepped into the sunlight. Leah's hand was in hers, trembling with relief. Tears streaked the young woman's face, not of fear, but of release, of pride. She looked up at her mother as though seeing her for the first time, not just as a parent, but as a warrior who had stood unshaken against the weight of a system. Naomi gave her hand a small squeeze. The fight had been brutal, but in this moment they had won. But Naomi's story did not end there. Half a year later, she sat at a long, mahogany table in front of Congress cameras, clicking lawmakers shifting in their seats. She spoke into a microphone, her voice calm, but resonant, carrying the weight of everything that had come before. We cannot let another citizen endure what I endured. We cannot allow silence to be mistaken for justice, nor arrogance to replace accountability. That is why I proposed the Carter Protocol. Her recommendations were precise, mandatory body cameras for every traffic stop, verified channels for confirming federal credentials, independent oversight for all misconduct complaints. They were not radical demands. They were protections as clear as glass, protections that might have spared her humiliation and countless others theirs. The chamber listened. Senators leaned forward. Reporters scribbled furiously. And across the country, communities who had once doubted whether justice could still breathe in America felt a spark of something they had long missed: hope. Naomi ended her testimony with words that carried more force than any gavel. Justice delayed is justice denied. But today, justice spoke loud enough for the whole nation to hear. The applause that followed wasn't thunderous. It was steady, respectful, the kind of sound that acknowledges both pain and victory. Back in her home that evening, Naomi sat with Leah on the porch. The garden rustled in the late summer air. The flag across the street waved softly. And for the first time in months, the world felt like it had tilted back toward balance. For those of us who watched it unfold, the lesson stayed. That laughter can be cruel, that silence can be strategy, and that truth, when given its moment, has the power to crack even the hardest walls. The video ends there, and you sitting here with me may feel both relief and fire. Relief that justice, at least this once, prevailed. Fire that it should never take so much to make it happen. But maybe that's the gift Naomi left us, the reminder that justice doesn't whisper. When it finally speaks, it roars, and we are meant to listen. And that brings us to the end of Dr. Naomi Carter's journey, a story not just about one woman in a courtroom, but about what justice truly means when power is abused. It reminds us that silence can be strength, truth will always find its voice, and dignity can withstand even the harshest trial. If this story moved you, please take a moment to hit the like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe to Mr. Mac's Stories so you never miss the powerful lessons and heartfelt tales we bring to life. Your support means more than numbers. It's the encouragement that fuels our team to keep creating meaningful stories that inspire and connect us all. Remember this when you think of justice told through the power of storytelling. Let Mr. Mac's stories be the name that stays with you.